Your identity feels stable only when outcomes agree with you, and that is precisely why it collapses when they don't. The result is not the problem, the dependence is. When attention is placed on outcomes as proof of worth, every result becomes a verdict, and every delay, rejection, or failure is treated as a structural threat rather than a simple external condition, which forces the mind into constant negotiation with things it does not control. The mistake begins earlier. It begins when outcome is promoted into a measure of self. This is not pressure from the world. It is misvaluation within it. When success is taken as confirmation, identity expands with it. When it disappears, identity contracts just as quickly, not because anything essential changed, but because the standard itself was unstable from the start. The problem is not that outcomes fluctuate. They always do. The problem is that you allowed something unstable to define something that demands stability. Examine what you are using as your measure, and correct it before it collapses again. You place your identity on outcomes, but outcomes were never within your authority to begin with, and this confusion is where instability starts, because the moment something outside your control becomes the foundation of who you are, your sense of self is no longer grounded in anything you can actually govern. A result arrives, and you take it as confirmation, as if it speaks about you, as if it measures something internal, when in fact it only reflects a convergence of conditions, timing, other people, chance, circumstance, none of which belong to your ruling faculty, yet you absorb it as if it were yours, and from that moment forward, you begin to defend, chase, and fear outcomes not because they matter in themselves, but because you have assigned them authority over your identity. This is the first boundary error. What is yours is the judgment you form, the assent you give, the intention you hold, the way you respond to what appears. What is not yours is the outcome that follows, the reception it receives, the recognition it gains, or the position it produces, yet when these are confused, effort shifts away from what can be governed and toward what cannot, and frustration becomes inevitable, not because the world is unstable, but because your placement of identity is. Consider a structure built on moving ground. Each time the ground shifts, the structure trembles, not because the structure is weak in its material, but because its foundation was never fixed. Outcomes behave the same way. They fluctuate, they arrive and disappear, they elevate and diminish without asking for your consent, and yet you treat them as if they were stable enough to support identity, and then you are surprised when your sense of self rises and falls with them. The instability is not in the result. It is in the placement. When identity is tied to something external, every external variation becomes an internal disturbance, because the mind has already agreed that this external thing matters as a measure of self, and once that agreement is made, the mind must constantly monitor, defend, and react to every change in that external field. This is why success brings temporary expansion followed by fear of loss, and failure brings contraction followed by urgency to repair, not because either state defines you, but because you have allowed both to act as if they do. And this is where effort becomes misdirected. Instead of refining judgment, attention is spent managing outcomes. Instead of correcting assent, energy is spent chasing validation. Instead of stabilizing the ruling faculty, the mind attaches itself to conditions that refuse stability, and then calls the resulting disturbance pressure, stress, or unfairness, when in fact it is the predictable consequence of assigning identity to what does not belong to you. The boundary must be restored. Identity cannot be grounded in what fluctuates, because anything that depends on variables outside your authority will always remain vulnerable to them, and vulnerability here is not weakness of character, but error in placement, because you have anchored something essential to something unstable. To correct this is not to reject outcomes or pretend they do not exist, but to remove them from the role they were never meant to occupy, which is the role of defining you, because the moment they are removed from that position, they return to what they actually are, external events, while identity returns to what it must be built on, which is your use of judgment, your discipline of assent, and your capacity to govern your own response. Without this correction, every outcome will continue to act like a verdict. With it, outcomes return to being events. An outcome appears, and before any deliberate examination takes place, the mind moves quickly, almost invisibly, from noticing it to interpreting it, and then, without pause, to agreeing with that interpretation, and it is this agreement, not the outcome itself, that begins to reshape identity. The result is seen. That is the impression. It carries no verdict yet. But the mind does not leave it there. It adds meaning. This means I am succeeding. Or the opposite, this means I am failing. That added layer is not part of the event. It is judgment. And then comes the critical step that is rarely noticed, the moment where the mind accepts that judgment as true. That acceptance is assent. Without that assent, the outcome would remain what it is, an external event, complete in itself, requiring no identity adjustment. But once the mind agrees with the interpretation, the outcome is no longer just observed, it is endorsed as a measure, and from that point forward, it begins to reorganize how you see yourself. This movement is fast, often automatic, rarely questioned. Consider a simple symbolic frame. An outcome is placed in front of you like a sign, but the sign has no inscription until you write one onto it, and then, once written, you begin to treat the inscription as if it were always there, as if the outcome itself carried the message, when in fact the message came from your own judgment, and the moment you agreed with it, you granted it authority. That is the hinge. Because once assent is given, the consequences follow without needing further decision. If the outcome is interpreted as success and accepted as proof of worth, the mind expands, attaches, and begins to protect that state. If the outcome is interpreted as failure and accepted as deficiency, the mind contracts, resists, and seeks correction, not of judgment, but of the external condition that triggered it. In both cases, identity shifts, not because the outcome changed you, but because you agreed that it had the right to. This is why fragility persists even when outcomes improve. A favorable result produces temporary stability, but only because it aligns with the judgment already accepted, and the moment conditions change, the same mechanism activates again, producing instability just as quickly, because the process was never corrected, only temporarily satisfied. The mind continues to wait for the next outcome to confirm or threaten what it has already decided to believe about itself. Pause here. The outcome did not declare anything. The interpretation did. And the disturbance did not come from seeing the result, but from agreeing with what you decided it meant. This distinction is often missed because reaction feels immediate, but immediacy is not the same as inevitability. The impression arrives automatically. The judgment follows quickly. But assent, the agreement, is still an act, even if it feels invisible. And it is precisely because it feels automatic that it remains unexamined, and therefore uncorrected. So the sequence continues unchecked. Outcome appears. Meaning is added. Agreement is given. Identity adjusts. And then behavior follows in defense of that adjustment, reinforcing the entire cycle, not because it is necessary, but because it has become habitual. To see this clearly is not to slow down time or eliminate reaction, but to recognize where the transition occurs, where something external is turned into something internal, where an event becomes a verdict only because the mind allows it to, and where the first real point of control exists, not at the level of outcomes, but at the level of assent. If that point is ignored, identity will continue to follow outcomes. If it is examined, the process can be interrupted before identity is handed over again. You understand the mechanism, but understanding alone does not interrupt it, because the movement from impression to assent is not corrected by insight in the moment it happens, it is corrected by what has been trained before that moment arrives, and without that preparation, the mind returns to its familiar habit of agreeing too quickly. Discipline is not force applied after reaction. It is structure built before reaction. If the mind is left untrained, it will continue to treat every outcome as meaningful, every result as a signal, Every shift has something to interpret, and then it will agree with those interpretations out of habit, not examination, which is why the same disturbance repeats even when you know it is unnecessary, because knowledge without training does not alter the speed or direction of assent. Consider a simple symbolic condition, a gate that is meant to filter what enters, but instead remains open, allowing every impression to pass through without resistance, and then later you attempt to correct what has already entered, which is far more difficult than preventing the entry in the first place. This is how untrained assent behaves. It does not examine at the threshold. It reacts after acceptance. Discipline begins at that threshold. Not by suppressing impressions, not by denying reaction, but by training the pause between appearance and agreement, so that when an outcome presents itself, the mind does not immediately convert it into identity, but holds it long enough to question what is being added to it, what judgment is forming, and whether that judgment deserves acceptance. This training is repetitive. It is not dramatic. It is not performed at the peak of pressure. It is built in smaller moments, where the cost of error is low but the structure of response is the same, because the mind does not suddenly change its behavior under stress, it reveals what it has practiced. If you practice immediate agreement, you will continue to agree. If you practice examination, you will begin to interrupt that agreement. This is why discipline is often misunderstood. It is not endurance against outcomes. It is not resistance to emotion. It is not the construction of a hardened identity that cannot be affected. It is the quiet correction of how quickly and how carelessly the mind gives permission to impressions to define what they were never meant to define. Without this correction, identity remains exposed. Each outcome becomes an entry point. Each interpretation becomes a potential distortion. Each assent becomes a reinforcement of instability, because the mind continues to outsource its measure to something that fluctuates, and then attempts to repair the resulting instability through more effort directed at outcomes, rather than correcting the internal process that created the dependence in the first place. With discipline, the sequence begins to change. The outcome still appears. The impression still forms. But the agreement is no longer immediate. There is space. There is examination. There is refusal when necessary. And in that refusal, identity is no longer handed over to the result, because the result has not been granted the authority to define anything beyond itself. This is not a one-time correction. It is a repeated act. And through repetition, the mind becomes less willing to surrender itself to every appearance, less eager to convert outcomes into measures, and more stable not because outcomes have improved, but because the process that once made them dangerous has been brought under governance. When an outcome appears and the mind begins to move toward interpretation, the practice is not to stop the appearance, but to intercept the agreement that usually follows it, and this interception must become operational, not theoretical, because without a repeatable way to act in that moment, the old pattern resumes without resistance. So the first action is simple, but precise. When a result presents itself, do not allow it to complete its meaning immediately. Let it remain incomplete. When outcome, pause before naming it. This pause is not hesitation. It is refusal to finalize judgment too quickly. The mind will attempt to fill the gap with a conclusion, success, failure, progress, regression, but the practice is to hold the event at the level of appearance and delay the addition of meaning, because meaning is where identity begins to attach. Then comes the second action, separate what is seen from what is being added. When impression forms, identify the added statement. This happened is not the same as this defines me, but in untrained response, those two merge instantly, and the correction is to make that addition visible, to recognize that the second statement did not arrive with the event, but was supplied by your own judgment, and once visible, it can be examined instead of accepted. Then comes the third action, refuse automatic assent when the judgment exceeds what the event contains. When interpretation appears, question its authority. Does the outcome actually contain this meaning, or is the mind assigning it because it has learned to use results as measures? This question interrupts the flow, not by denying the event, but by refusing to elevate it beyond its scope, and in that refusal, identity is no longer handed over automatically. Consider a symbolic frame. An outcome is like a surface onto which the mind projects a label, and the practice is not to remove the surface, but to stop treating the projection as if it were part of the surface itself. The label can be withheld. And if withheld, the outcome remains neutral in relation to identity. Then comes the fourth action: redirect attention to what actually belongs to you in that moment. When evaluation begins, return to response. What can be governed now is not the outcome that has already occurred, but the judgment you are forming about it, the assent you are considering giving, and the next action you choose. And by shifting attention here, the mind is brought back to its proper domain, where stability can exist because authority exists. This sequence must be repeated, not occasionally, but consistently, because the habit it replaces is constant, and without repetition, the old pattern reasserts itself through familiarity alone. When outcome, pause. When judgment forms, expose it. When assent approaches, examine it. When attention drifts outward, return it inward. These are not steps to perform once. They are movements to practice until they become the default structure of response. There will still be moments where the mind agrees too quickly, where identity contracts or expands before examination takes place, but even then, the same structure applies in reverse. The correction is not to condemn the reaction, but to revisit the judgment that was accepted and withdraw agreement from it, because assent can be reconsidered even after it has been given, and through that reconsideration, the mind weakens the pattern that made the reaction possible. Over time, the distance between impression and assent increases, not because the world slows down, but because the mind no longer rushes to convert outcomes into identity, and in that distance, stability begins to form, not from controlling results, but from governing the process that once made those results decisive. When identity is no longer fastened to outcomes, what remains is not emptiness, but a different kind of stability, one that does not expand with success or collapse with failure, because it is no longer dependent on either, and this stability is often mistaken for detachment from life, when in fact it is a more precise engagement with it, since action is no longer distorted by the need to protect or repair an identity built on unstable ground. Outcomes still occur. They still vary. They still produce effects in the external world. But internally, they no longer carry the same weight, because the mind has withdrawn the agreement that once allowed them to define anything beyond themselves, and without that agreement, their reach ends where they occur. Consider again the symbolic structure. Before, identity stood on shifting ground, rising and falling with each movement beneath it. Now the structure has been relocated, not to a place where the ground stops moving, but to a place where the structure is no longer built on that ground at all, and because of that, movement continues without producing collapse. This is what changes. Not the world. The relation to it. There is still effort, but it is directed differently. Action is taken without requiring confirmation from the result. Work is performed without needing the outcome to return meaning to it. Decisions are made without waiting for external validation to stabilize them, and because of this, the cycle of expansion and contraction weakens, not because conditions improve, but because identity is no longer participating in that cycle. This does not remove difficulty. Loss still occurs. Failure still appears. Delay still frustrates. But the disturbance they produce is reduced to what belongs to them, because they are no longer amplified by the added layer of identity judgment, and without that layer, they do not penetrate as deeply, nor do they linger as long, since there is nothing internal sustaining them beyond the event itself. Freedom, in this sense, is not a permanent state that is achieved and held without effort. It is the ongoing condition of not surrendering identity to what does not belong to you, and because the world continues to present outcomes, this condition must be maintained through continued examination and refusal of misplaced agreement. If that maintenance stops, the old pattern returns, not because it is stronger, but because it is familiar. So freedom is not the absence of disturbance. It is the reduction of unnecessary disturbance. It is the removal of the extra layer that turns events into verdicts, and the preservation of identity within the only domain where it can remain stable, which is the domain of judgment, assent, and response. Nothing external can guarantee this. Nothing external can take it away. Only agreement can. The instability you experience was never created by outcomes themselves, but by the role you assigned to them, and as long as that role remains uncorrected, no improvement in results will produce lasting stability, because the same mechanism that once tied identity to failure will continue to tie it to success, and both will remain equally fragile. This is the central error. Not that you care about outcomes, but that you use them as measures of self. Once that measure is accepted, every result becomes a test you must pass, every delay becomes a threat you must resolve, and every variation becomes something that alters how you see yourself, not because it should, but because you have already agreed that it can, and from that agreement, the cycle continues without needing further justification. Correction does not begin by changing outcomes. It begins by removing them from that role. The moment an outcome is no longer treated as evidence of identity, its influence changes immediately, because it no longer carries interpretive authority, and without that authority, it cannot expand or contract your sense of self, it can only remain what it is, an external event that requires response, not identification. This is where stability becomes possible. Not in securing better results, but in refusing to let results determine what was never theirs to define, which is your worth, your position, or your identity, and once that refusal becomes consistent, the fluctuations that once created disturbance lose their reach, not because they disappear, but because they are no longer allowed to extend beyond their boundary. Return to what is yours to govern.